Hello, everyone, and welcome to a discussion on potential Republican candidates in the 2024 presidential election. I'm your host, Michael Richardson. Joining me today is Ryan Pagano.
Going on?
Amber Bianchi.
Hello.
And Jack Sargent.
Hello.
Before we begin, we do want to say that any thoughts or opinions expressed during this broadcast do not reflect those of WRHU, Hofstra University, and its Board of Trustees. All opposing opinions can be sent to programming at WRHU.org. As of the time of this recording on June 2nd, there are 7 declared major candidates, with 3 more set to make an announcement. We'll be going through each of those 10 individuals, what their campaign centers on, and whether they could secure the GOP nomination. As it stands, former President Donald Trump holds a double-digit lead in most polls against second-place opponent Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Many of the other candidates are polling at 5 points or less. Let's start the discussion by honing in on Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Amber, what exactly is the governor campaigning on, and does that message have a broad enough appeal to the Republican base?
I think that DeSantis is really pushing the line that America is going in the wrong direction. He's pushing his opinion that the southern border, our Mexican-American border, is collapsing between the drug cartels, the immigrants crossing the border, and also the drug smuggling across the border. He's pushing that the Biden administration is making it harder economically for the average family to make ends meet. His focus is on younger generations and how the generations now are trying to just pass the torch of issues onto younger generations, which I find is really counterproductive because less than 17% of Gen Z, which is kind of his main focus, are registered Republicans. Most of that generation is Democrats, and he's trying to push for a GOP nomination. He's focusing on schools and funding younger educations and other main focuses for that age group.
Well, I think at the same time, he's almost become a conservative champion for those causes like school choice. He's centering his campaign really on this idea of getting rid of the quote wokeness in America. And I think that has a lot of depth. I think a lot of voters will gravitate towards that. But look, you have a governor who narrowly won election in 2018, but then a lot of people will attribute him to turning Florida into a red state. I mean, he flipped Miami-Dade County, which sided with former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in 2016. He basically changed it by 20 points. There was a 20-point Republican flip over 6 years, and some will attribute that to him and what he's done.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here. It could very much translate to a national stage, but Ron DeSantis has to clear the first hurdle, which is win the Republican nomination. And it doesn't translate, or what he's done doesn't translate to winning the Republican nomination because he's trying to run as Trump light or Trump. I'm Trump, but I am more electable than Donald Trump is. And Donald Trump has been crushing Ron DeSantis in terms of the political ads space. And he was out in front of DeSantis. DeSantis didn't announce until last week, and Trump has been criticizing DeSantis since the moment that he made it official that he was seeking re-election, and DeSantis has not really been able to effectively counter that. And as a result of that, that's why you see Donald Trump with the massive lead in the nomination race that he has right now. And it's not a lead that DeSantis is going to be able to close effectively, in my opinion. I think that Ron DeSantis is the only one that has a small chance to deprive Donald Trump of the nomination, but he's not going to because it's impossible for him to close this much of a gap with the way that Donald Trump has been attacking him. Rhetorically, he's been out in front of DeSantis, as I said, and it's been a major handicap to DeSantis' abilities to win this nomination.
Trump endorsed DeSantis in 2018, and you see Governor DeSantis honing in on a lot of what Trump has said. He supports the Southern Wall. He even had that in the campaign ad all the way back in his first gubernatorial run. I think he's trying to trend this line where he wants to be different from the former president. He wants to be someone who doesn't as much associate with the 2020 election being stolen or other controversies. But at the same time, a lot of his policy is similar. So how he's going to sort of trend that line, I think it's, like you said, I think it's going to be very difficult when he really can't criticize the former president, or at least I don't think he will, when so many of his policies are so similar to that of the 45th president. Ryan, what are your thoughts on Governor DeSantis?
If anything, he is definitely going to be the main opposition to President Trump. And we can clearly see that from all the other candidates that have already declared as of now. That's not to say that the rest of them aren't going to make big runs, but what I am saying is that if Trump isn't going to get the nomination, it's without a doubt going to be Ron DeSantis. He's made himself in a figure seemingly larger than life, especially these past couple of years with COVID taking its fair toll on Florida and a bunch of other social issues that have garnered a lot of national attention. And whether you believe that to be a lot of positive attention or a lot of negative is merely up to interpretation. But also, he's been escalating just a huge feud between himself and former President Trump, which, seems a little crazy to think about now, considering that just 2 years back, these two seemed to be very buddy-buddy with each other. But now we have DeSantis and Trump going back and forth at each other in the local press. And one of the big issues that I definitely think could very well win Republicans over to DeSantis' side, he has promised to complete the wall that Trump could not and actually close the border like former President Trump had promised. So that definitely could get a lot of people on his side, and it's not going to be much of a shocker if he gets so much support because of those comments.
But let's move on to someone who also announced their campaign last week as of the time of this recording, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott. Now, Scott has served in the Senate for several years now, and he's campaigning on traditional conservative values. Scott is someone who did not support efforts to overturn the 2020 United States election, and his campaign really centers on, a lot like DeSantis, stopping, quote, indoctrination in schools, improving crime levels. Does anyone here have any thoughts on whether Senator Scott could secure the nomination?
Yeah, I think Tim Scott is trying to run the prototypical establishment Republican candidate establishment candidate type of campaign that we've seen run for time in memoriam since the Republican Party became the conservative small government party that it is today, with some of the new cultural issues worked into it with wokeness and what's being taught in schools and things like that. But typically Tim Scott, for the most part, Tim Scott is going to try to run that back to the traditional, what we always used to stand for pre-Donald Trump campaign. And that's not going to get him very far because the Republican base, which Donald Trump cultivated and grew very popular in, those types of figures, that establishment, traditional conservative type figures, are not very popular among those folks because they don't really bring a lot to the table in the eyes of a lot of those people. So Tim Scott is the type of person, and I think it's very interesting, when he entered the race, Donald Trump was very conciliatory towards him. In his statement, he wished him luck and things like that, which gives the indication that Donald Trump doesn't really take Tim Scott's challenge seriously, which I think is something that's telling about his candidacy. But he's one of those people. He's been in elected office now for almost a decade. He was appointed to the seat and then won a full term in 2014, and then was obviously reelected, or won a full term, I should say, in 2016, and then was reelected last cycle. So he's someone who's been around, and this gets his name out there and gets spotlight on him. But I don't really think he's going to move forward much in this primary field because he's the type of candidate that the Republican base has wanted to move away from. And I don't really think that he offers much to bring those folks that don't like the traditional establishment type of figure into his camp.
Now, another South Carolina political figure who's vying for the GOP nomination is former U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley. Amber, what do you think of Nikki Haley's chances to win the GOP nomination?
So I think she holds a chance only because of so there's kind of two different sides of Republican beliefs, obviously. There's the very Republican, and then there's I like the economics beliefs of Republican parties. I think she holds that spot a little bit because she's not pushing, she's pushing for the new generation. She's pushing a religious point with how she dealt with South Carolina during the shooting a couple years back. She's focusing on how, the core roots and issues within the US's building blocks.
I think Haley does have differing advantages to certain voters in the GOP, particularly when it comes to her foreign policy experience. I think for similar reasons, we've said in this panel to this point, I don't think she has enough sway necessarily in the current political climate.
I'm going to counter both of you guys really quickly. I think Nikki Haley is frankly anathema to the Republican base. She's been on both sides of so many issues, especially after January 6th. She preemptively criticized Donald Trump for inciting the insurrection there. And then a couple of weeks after, she got major flack from within the right-wing base of the Republican Party. She retracted that in some sort of fashion. And overall, she was someone in 2015/2016. She was originally against Donald Trump for a long time. She was someone who was floated as someone who could have entered the 2016 race and be an opponent to him. And then she eventually came around, supported him, was in his administration. From what I've seen, is a lot of people have seen through that in her, and the Republican base views her as a sort of flip-flopper establishment rhino Republican, if you want to say that. So I think Nikki Haley has no advantages going forward into this Republican primary in a contest where you have to, if you're going to win, you have to secure that Trump base, and there's just no way she's going to secure it.
The Trump base is absolutely going to be critical to whoever secures this nomination. Now, moving to another candidate, author and entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy is also campaigning for the GOP nomination. Ryan, do you think Ramaswamy is as much of a long shot as some people make him out to be?
Well, Michael, you just never really know with a lot of these now. A lot of people, you could say, haven't really heard of Ramaswamy before making recent headlines and saying that he wants to seek the Republican nomination. But considering the fact that he is very clearly shown that he wants to expand Donald Trump's America First message to the grandest of audiences, and going around with that agenda, especially if somebody like Trump or Nikki Haley isn't able to garner enough support to win that Republican nomination, Ramaswamy could very well swoop right in, especially with that existing supporter base. Because to be quite frank, I'm not too sure a lot of them are going to necessarily support DeSantis, especially with the recent feuds that we've been seeing in our news cycle more often than not. But as a successful entrepreneur, somebody who's founded a ton of successful enterprises, I mean, the Trump similarities are right there. He's just seen as a businessman who could make very good economic decisions for this country. It's something that we saw under former President Trump. You're seeing a lot of parallels here with one of the underdogs. Don't be surprised if he suddenly swoops in to secure that nomination. I mean, again, I'm not saying that it's likely it could happen, but I mean, we've seen it with 2016. You never know.
He's giving me a lot of Andrew Yang vibes, coming in very much as an outsider. But when his agenda is already so similar to former President Trump, he's literally labeled it America First 2.0. I don't know how many people he's necessarily going to convince, especially when he's calling for raising the voting age to 25. That may not go over so well with many GOP voters.
I mean, that's going to be such a huge issue as well. And people make enough of an issue about the fact that the voting age could be lowered to 16. And people are already taking enough issue with that. I mean, just imagine if it gets raised from 18 to 25, never mind 21, where you have to be that age to buy products such as alcohol in this country. I mean, could you imagine how much of a firestorm that there would be all across the country if that were to happen? It'd be insanity.
Now let's move on to former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson. Jack, what are your thoughts? Do you think that Asa Hutchinson, who's currently polling among the worst of the candidates we've talked about so far, do you think he could pull an upset and win the nomination at this point?
Absolutely not. I think that he is even more viewed as even more of an establishment figure than someone like Tim Scott or Nikki Haley. And in some aspects with Tim Scott has some, to specifically compare him to Asa Hutchinson, Tim Scott has some things in the Senate that he has been particularly upfront for, which might garner some appeal within the conservative movement. But Asa Hutchinson was someone who was term limited, and it was term limited following his 2018 governor election in Arkansas. And he was very critical of Donald Trump throughout the last year, 2 years, really, of his administration. And that really sort of started to alienate a lot of people. And one thing that was super high profile, which got him labeled as a rhino, was when he vetoed the Arkansas state legislature passed a bill to ban transgender athletes from competing in women's sports, and he vetoed that. And that was something that among the right-wing base is a popular position, and that was not a popular veto, and he took a lot of heat from that in right-wing media. And I think that he's just viewed as another one of these establishment figures, the old guard type, if you want to call them that just doesn't resonate with the base at all. He's also been someone who's been in electoral politics for a very long time. Generally, the right-wing base does not like those types of candidates. And there's very little that he offers in terms of that, unless you have someone who is still very much a type of McCain-Romney Republican. Maybe he offers something with those folks, but I think even Nikki Haley carries more weight among that crowd.
I think that Hutchinson, going back to what you said, I think he has alienated a lot of that Trump base. He's said that former President Trump, after his indictment, should not be allowed to run. He should drop out of the race. And that's likely not to go over well with too many voters, and that may reflect in his polling numbers.
He seems like a candidate that isn't really going to be able to pull his own weight, especially with a bunch of bigger and arguably more popular candidates out there. And he reminds me a lot more of these country club Republicans, so to speak, where they provide a little more stability and they're not as radical as a lot of other Republicans have seen. But that's definitely something that could have worked in, say, the 80s or 90s, but it's just not an approach that doesn't really work today. And yeah, it resonates with a lot of more people, don't get me wrong, but the way the state of the Republican Party is today is that they're looking for a lot more candidates that are going to be a little more radical than, say, just the average Joe Schmo. They're looking for people like Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis to lead the way, people that are not afraid to have a little bit of guts and stand up to their critics and believe in what they feel is truly right.
I just don't think he represents enough of a change for voters to want to go away from candidates we've talked about. But one candidate who is undeclared, but is by all intents and purposes going to announce his campaign for president, is former Vice President Mike Pence. Now, to the whole panel, what does the former Vice President need to do in order to appeal to the GOP base?
I think, Michael, that he needs to reintroduce himself as not being Trump's second in command. He needs to come up with a new approach. He has spent the last 2.5 years distancing himself from Trump and laying the groundwork for his campaign. He needs to just move away from Trump. The Trump voters aren't going to move away from Trump to move to Pence with his current status.
Well, Amber, you can make a very good argument here that Pence already has distanced himself from Trump and made himself to be a completely new person, a completely new politician with that reinvented sort of status. And a lot of it has to do with him not having to worry about the classified documents case that Trump is currently dealing with right now. I mean, he took classified materials to his Indiana home when he left the vice president's office in 2021, but it's run its course. It has, and we don't see any controversies or anything similar from Pence now. And yeah, he'll definitely still continue to move on from that sort of image, but he is going to appeal really heavily to the Republicans that just want somebody who's a lot more stable, somebody that you could say is maybe slightly similar to Asa Hutchinson to the extent that they're not as radical compared to some certain other candidates, but he already has the pre-existing base, as he already has that name recognition, that prestige to go off of that a lot of these other candidates do not have. I don't see him winning the nomination, but he could make a deep run.
I think that Mike Pence is sort of going to try to cultivate the same group of voters that Ron DeSantis would go for it. And I think that that's going to be something that's difficult for him because the people who would support Mike Pence are the people who would support Ron DeSantis, and that's the traditional Republican type figures. And then also with a little bit of, he could mix in some support from evangelicals there because he does have a lot of credibility amongst that camp. But the problem is that he's going to have to compete with Ron DeSantis, who a lot of people view as more electorally viable in a national sense, because Mike Pence does carry the weight of being in the Donald Trump administration with him, which, not that Ron DeSantis has no association with Donald Trump, but in a general election standpoint, it would be a lot easier to criticize the Trump criticism would stick more to Mike Pence than I think it would even to Ron DeSantis. And I think that's his biggest issue. But his chance is to peel off and get support from the same group of voters that would support Mike Pence, as people that want a return to a return to the country club Republican days of before 2016. The problem is that there's really two big name recognition candidates that have that, and they're both going to be competing with each other in this, and it's going to be Ron DeSantis and Mike Pence, and there's simply not going to be enough people to go around between those two. And a lot of people that would initially support Pence will probably toward the end of the day shift back to DeSantis once they see that DeSantis is the only one that's truly viable as that alternative to Donald Trump.
Now, let's go to a rapid fire round. We're going to talk about these next three candidates before we get to the last one here. What do we all think of talk radio host and candidate for governor of California in 2021, Larry Elder's odds of the nomination?
I think he's very similar to Vivek Ramaswamy. I think he, is from that America First MAGA swath of Republicans. And I think that he's in the race to try to see what kind of, how far he goes, and to get some more name recognition for him within that base and potentially set him up for a post-Trump future.
Another person who's undeclared but is set to make an announcement is North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. What are our thoughts on his chances of winning the nomination?
We haven't heard much from him. I really don't think he pulls any significant chance against Ron DeSantis or Trump, or even someone like Nikki Haley. He's not as well known.
And finally, of the undeclared candidates, we have former governor of New Jersey, Christie. Chris Christie dropped out before Super Tuesday in 2016. He got 7% in the New Hampshire primary, but amassed no delegates. Do you guys think that he could amass some delegates in this one, potentially enough to secure a majority?
I think Chris Christie's the one person in this field that is less popular than Asa Hutchinson. No, Chris Christie doesn't have any base anymore. All his electoral viability has seemed to have vanished from what it seemed like it might have been a decade ago.
Now, the last candidate we're going to talk about is former President Donald Trump. Now, I will chime in here, and I will say I think he's the likeliest to win the nomination. And mostly for the reasons that I think as the field expands, as it grows bigger and bigger, individuals need to fight for who is part of the Trump base and who isn't. And the majority of the Republican Party is with the former president. He's polling at double digits ahead of his second place opponent. And he amassed the most votes of any incumbent president in history in the last election. As more individuals come in and they try and siphon off different parts of the Republican base, I think that gives Trump more of a chance to not necessarily win a majority, but win a plurality in states. Because again, you don't need to win a majority in the state to get all the delegates. It's proportional. Say Trump gets 40% in Iowa and DeSantis gets 20%, and then you have a similar scenario with South Carolina or Nevada or Missouri or Florida. Then they'll get the former president to the amount he needs to secure the nomination, as other individuals like Hutchinson, like Pence, like Ramaswamy only get 5%, and that translates to a proportional amount of delegates. As the field expands, it makes it harder and harder, I think, for someone to win against Trump. I think the only viable way that an individual beats the former president is if one candidate coalesces around the rest. I think DeSantis as the second place challenger is the most obvious decision. I think if you have Haley, Scott, Ramaswamy, Pence, everyone else coalesce around the Florida governor, then I think there's a chance that that individual can beat former President Trump in the primary. But I just don't see that happening, particularly when so many individuals are coming in. They don't look like they want to drop out.
Yeah, so I think with the entrance of former Vice President Mike Pence, I think that even helps Trump even more, because I think the Trump supporters are the Trump supporters. They're not moving, they're not changing. Doesn't matter if Trump gets convicted of whatever. They're not moving. They love Trump. They're voting Trump in, and he's going to win. And that's what they think. I think that there's a field for Trump, and then there's a field for everybody else. And I think as Pence comes in, he's definitely going to bring DeSantis's ratings down.
You saw the former president actually gain in the polls right after his indictment. I think that really angered a lot of his base, but that may not translate necessarily to the general. So I want to open this up to the panel. Let's say it's another 2020 rematch in 2024, which, by the way, a lot of voters in polls aren't necessarily the most enthusiastic about. What chance does former President Trump stand against the likeliest to win the Democratic nomination, incumbent President Joe Biden?
He stands an excellent chance of beating Joe Biden. Joe Biden right now is deeply unpopular amongst the American people. He has an approval rating as low as 36%, and Joe Biden doesn't really have a lot to campaign on. One of the advantages that he had against Donald Trump in 2020, aside from everything else that Donald Trump had against him, was COVID and how COVID had ruined the economy. And I was listening to a podcast last week with Rick Wilson, one of the founders of the Lincoln Project, in it. And Rick Wilson said a big factor as to why Donald Trump was able to beat Joe Biden was because we, in terms of the Lincoln Project, but also just in general, it was possible to hammer Donald Trump on his handling of the economy. And the economy is often the most important thing for voters in a particular election. And that's not a luxury that Joe Biden is going to have against Donald Trump. He's going to campaign once again on "I'm not Trump," the alternative to Donald Trump, the perceived dangers that Donald Trump brings to the country if he were to be reelected. But the question is, how much is that message going to stick? Is it going to wane? And I think it's going to wane to a certain extent because voters can have short memories sometimes. And you don't have the memories of COVID fresh in people's minds because it's 2-3 years removed. By the time we get to 2024, we're going to be 3 years removed from the worst parts of COVID, even if you want to say the worst parts of COVID from the Biden administration, which was early to mid 2021, which that's going to be 3 years removed. Voters are going to have other issues. And that's not even thinking about the potential foreign policy ramifications. A lot of people don't approve of the way that Joe Biden has handled the Ukraine situation. And even if they do approve it, I have certainly seen plenty of people say, well, this wouldn't have happened if Donald Trump was in office. And that's something that Joe Biden's going to have to carry. And him as the president of the United States, fair or not, is going to have to wear a lot of the problems that happen both domestically and foreign policy wise. And we're 18 months away. If something drastic happens, either domestically or internationally, that's something that Joe Biden's going to have to wear as the president. And that's one of the many disadvantages that he's going to have going into this 2024 race.
I think former President Trump has an uphill battle for the general election in 2024. And I say that after the results of the 2022 midterms. In many of the most competitive states, the reality was that Trump's endorsement did not equate to a victory. I say that in Pennsylvania's Senate. I say that in the Arizona gubernatorial race. I say that in the New Hampshire senatorial race with Don Bolduc, who lost to Maggie Hassan. I say that to the gubernatorial race in Michigan, where Tudor Dixon lost to incumbent Gretchen Whitmer, among others. Say Trump did not endorse someone like Oz in the primary. Potentially you get McCormick to win, which he lost by less than 1,000 votes. Then that could translate to a different Senate majority. I think what Biden is going to campaign on is the exact same thing to what he campaigned on in 2020, is that he was not President Trump. And frankly, I think that's a message that still holds a lot of sway among voters. That is all the time we have for this discussion. I'm Michael Richardson. Thank you to Ryan, Amber, and Jack for being here with me today. Thanks as well to Troy Sika, who created the music heard in this discussion. Stay tuned to WRHU as we keep you up to date on the upcoming presidential election. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay well.